If Atlanta is lost to the Union, it will propel President Abraham Lincoln into a second term and the continuation of the war against the South. But if the Union falls, Confederate forces may be able to beat General Grant in his desperate bid to take Virginia and defeat the Confederacy. This is the story of the presidents, generals, and soldiers who lived through the Battle for Atlanta and the Summer of Fire. It is 1864, and the country has been divided for 4 years. Brother fights brother over the rights of the states under the government. This is the American Civil War. The fighting is divided into 2 strategic arenas, the Eastern and Western Theater. The Eastern Theater, comprised of Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C., is typically viewed as the more vital of the 2, for it houses the capitals of both sides. It is a 250-mile stretch that starts from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and ends at Petersburg, Virginia, just below Richmond. Over 200,000 men are to die in this smaller theater. But it is in the Western Theater where many of the more decisive and critical battles take place. The Western Theater spans the area east of the Mississippi River and west of the Appalachian Mountains. It is vital to the Confederacy as it contains major rivers that lead into the South's heartland, allowing for transit of supplies to the soldiers stationed in these vast expanses. With a much smaller army and the entirety of the Western Theater to defend, Confederate forces are stretched thin, leaving them vulnerable to Union attack. In March 1864, President Lincoln places newly promoted Lieutenant General Grant at the head of the entire Union Army. In turn, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman is put in charge of the Department of the Mississippi on March 18th. The Western Theater now rests on the shoulders of a mercurial major general with a mixed record, bouts of depression, and the tragedy of a son's death. Sherman's opponent in the Confederacy, General Joseph E. Johnston, comes to the Western Theater well ravaged by the rigors of the battlefield and tired of the war, as revealed after he was wounded by a shell.
I possessed in no degree the confidence of this government, and now a man who does enjoy it will succeed me and be able to accomplish what I never could.
But the Civil War and the Confederacy will never let go of General Johnston. General John Bell Hood will run into battle on horseback and not let the absence of a leg stop him from leading his men. When Hood returned to action in the Battle of Chickamauga in Georgia in the Western Theater on September 20th, after his arm was rendered useless by a shell, fate would prove his return to fighting short-lived. His right leg was severely wounded by a minie-ball and amputated. Things looked grave for General Hood, but he recovered to once more ride a horse by the following January. Where Johnston was already tired and disenchanted, Hood is determined and anxious to get back on the front lines. But what of the troops commanded by these generals? What have the rigors of war done to these men? Most are white, aged 18 to 30, and many are Protestant. They stand, on average, at 5'8" and weigh in around 143 pounds, while a majority are American-born. Some Irish, English, Hispanic, French, Italian, and German immigrants serve in both armies. 1/4 of the Union Army are foreigners. African American soldiers also fight in the Union Army, about 210,000. In 1862, the Confederacy started a draft that required men to serve, while the Union followed the next year. Soldiers of both sides could hire a non-draftee to take their place on the battlefield. At this moment, in March 1864, the players are about to come together in a bloody campaign, one upon which the fate of the war rests. Sherman stands ready with an army 80,000 strong, while Johnston's is half that size. The Union prepares from their base at Chattanooga, while Johnston and his men are at Dalton, setting up what fortifications and defenses they can amongst the ridges and valleys. Further east is Sherman's goal, the city of Atlanta. Atlanta is key to the Confederacy. The hub of the South, it is the main distribution point for the Confederacy, with a railroad that extends to the Midwest and is vital in bringing supplies to the soldiers. If the Union takes Atlanta, they will get possession of even more of the Western Theater. 9 states total will be under their thumb, and the Civil War will be tipped in favor of the North. General Johnston, after the Union's wheels begin turning, recognizes the importance of Atlanta.
The importance to the Confederacy of defeating the enterprise against Atlanta was not to be measured by military consequences alone. Political considerations were also involved and added much to the interest of that campaign.
Back in Washington, D.C., President Abraham Lincoln is nervous. No president since Andrew Jackson has served a second term since 1832, and none of them were faced with a civil war that proved longer lasting than initially anticipated. Many blame Lincoln for the Union's failure to end the war in a more timely manner. If there is not a major victory for the North before re-election, a candidate pushing for peace, perhaps on a pro-slavery platform, is bound to win the presidency. As Grant prepares to take the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia, Sherman must take the nerve center of Atlanta and also spread the Confederacy's forces thin. May 1st is the date set to begin Union machinations towards Atlanta. On that day, Sherman stands with his 3 armies: Major General James B. McPherson's Army of the Tennessee, Major General John M. Schofield's Army of the Ohio, and Major General George H. Thomas's Army of the Cumberland. They total 100,000 strong and are faced with a dire mission. First Lieutenant Ralsa C. Rice, who would be promoted on May 3rd, is part of Company B of the 125th Ohio Volunteer Infantry.
Bragg had been superseded by General Joe Johnston, known to be one of the ablest generals in the Confederate Army. Every effort had been made to create an army able to cope with Sherman. From the most reliable sources, the rebel army which now confronted us numbered 75,000 men, posted behind strong works or on such naturally defensive positions that fully made up any discrepancy in numbers.
When Greek meets Greek, then comes the tug of war. It starts with a skirmish on May 1st at Old Stone Church outside of Ringgold. Another occurs at Lee's Crossroads, right near Tunnel Hill and Ringgold Gap the next day. It is followed by skirmishes at both Catoosa Springs and Red Clay on May 3rd. May 4th marks the major start of the Atlanta campaign as Union troops stealthily move into position. General Thomas of the Federal's Army of the Cumberland moves his men along Ringgold's Western and Atlantic Railroad. On May 9th, General McPherson's Union Army of the Tennessee runs into such strong Confederate resistance near Resaca that one fierce battle later results in a Union retreat east towards the small town. McPherson moves his soldiers back 3 miles to Snake Creek Gap and feels Resaca itself is too strong for a military surprise. In retrospect, Sherman is positive McPherson's army could have handled the town's small brigade and issued a critical blow to Johnston's army. But General Sherman's further plan is to disrupt the railroad and telegraph lines south of Dalton and impede the flow of communication and resources further down the line. The hope is to force Johnston to evacuate his headquarters in the town of Dalton. If Johnston does elect to send a detachment of men, however, they will be forced to fight on ground advantageous to the Union. Either way, Johnston's army will be depleted. On the evening of May 11th, Sherman learns of Johnston's evacuation of Dalton and moves towards Resaca. On May 12th, Johnston establishes a defensive position around the invaluable Western Atlantic Railroad at the Oostenaula River in anticipation of a Union attack.
Johnston, as I anticipated, had abandoned all his well-prepared defenses at Dalton and was found inside of Resaca with the bulk of his army, holding his divisions well in hand, acting purely on the defensive, and fighting well at all points of conflict.
Resaca will become a war zone. May 14th, the Battle of Resaca begins as nearly 100,000 Union troops pour out of Snake Creek Gap and head east towards the small town. The fighting breaks out to the north of Resaca and continues into the next day. Corporal Joseph W. Gatskill, Company B of the 104th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, is at Resaca.
Pride and a personal sense of duty and honor sustain as the bugle sounds the charge, and all go forward with lusty yells, the screaming of shot and shell seeming to infuse one with a strong desire to reach the harmless end of firearms that are dealing out death in the ranks.
Sherman seeks to block the Confederates' avenue of retreat by crossing the Oostenaula River. Meanwhile, Sherman sends General Girard and his cavalry down the Oostenaula to, if possible, interrupt the railroad between Calhoun and Kingston to the southwest of Resaca. On the 15th, McPherson and his men gain the higher ground, a ridge overlooking the town. It allows his artillery to inflict damage to the Oostenaula Railroad Bridge. When General Johnston learns of this, he exercises the better part of valor.
Upon this, the idea of fighting north of the Oostenaula was abandoned at once, and the orders to Lieutenant General Hood were countermanded. Stewart's division did not receive the countermand from Corps headquarters in time to prevent its execution of the previous order and engaging the enemy, and of course it suffered before being recalled. The danger that threatened our line of communications made me regard the continued occupation of Resaca as too hazardous.
His forces leave Resaca, setting fire to the bridges behind him to slow Union pursuit. He had little choice when faced with overwhelming numbers. A pursuit begins, with Sherman's forces hot on the heels of Johnston's. On the 17th, a division of Thomas's Army of the Cumberland makes contact with the rear guard of the Confederate Army. Artillery is exchanged, and by the next morning, the Confederate forces have again moved on. Johnston places his army between the towns of Kingston and Cassville, southwest of Resaca. After a brief skirmish with Thomas's forces, Johnston's men retreat into Cassville, where they establish a secure line and await the oncoming Union Army. It is May 19th. General Sherman.
The stout resistance made by the enemy along our whole front of a couple of miles indicated a purpose to fight at Cassville. And as the night was closing in, General Thomas and I were together along with our skirmish lines near the seminary on the edge of town, where musket bullets from the enemy were cutting the leaves of the trees pretty thickly about us.
Johnston is shocked when unexpected Union cavalrymen approach his unit from the right. The appearance of artillery firing at the center of the line leads Johnston to make a tough call, one that puts him in direct conflict with General Hood, and one he will admittedly regret in later years. General Hood.
An army fighting and retreating at the same time, taking up positions day after day, to be given up only under cover of darkness, suffers great loss. Let this policy be continued for a distance of 100 miles, and the pride, pomp, and circumstance of glorious war are lost in a somewhat funereal procession.
The next morning, like before, Johnston and his men quietly retreat from Cassville for the security of the Allatoona Mountains. His men are ragged, and even worse, demoralized. Captain Henry Richards of Company F, 93rd Ohio.
Our men look haggard and worn out. We have full rations of pork, hard bread, sugar, and coffee, nothing else. We have no clothing, tents, nor baggage, nothing but what we carry. As we are obliged to carry 3 days' rations on our person, it makes a good load for hot weather, though the nights are cold.
Sherman, meanwhile, knows the strategic advantages to be had by the Confederates in the Allatoona and opts to move around Johnston's left flank. The forces do clash at a small church known as the New Hope Church. This is where Johnston's army, anticipating Sherman's maneuver, stands ready. Johnston shrewdly prepares the ambush, knowing that Sherman would avoid Allatoona altogether. Hood and his army march into New Hope on the 24th and take position behind the frontal defenses and to the right. One brigade even uses church tombstones as cover. It is 5 p.m. on May 25th when Union soldiers arrive. At the head of Sherman's forces are General Joseph Hooker's 20th Corps, broken up into 3 divisions, each on separate roads. Sherman sees the line as a small one and orders Hooker to attack. He underestimates the strength of Johnston's forces, and it becomes a bloodbath. General Sherman.
The woods were so dense and the resistance so spirited that Hooker could not carry the position, though the battle was noisy and prolonged far into the night. At this point, New Hope was the accidental intersection of the road leading from Altoona to Dallas with that from Van Wert to Marietta. It was 4 miles northeast of Dallas, and from the bloody fighting there for the next week, was given a nickname by the soldiers.
This hellhole is an unforgiving and wide ravine that Hooker's men must scramble down, making them sitting ducks for the Confederate forces on the other side. It also makes it difficult for Hooker to coordinate, as they are buffeted by shrapnel from one of 16 Confederate cannons. Union General Williams.
They poured canister and shrapnel into us from all directions, except the rear.
The fighting lasts 2 hours. The Confederates lose around 400 of a 4,000-man division, while the Union Army of 16,000 suffers losses and casualties totaling 1,665. Skirmishing continues throughout the next day. The Battle of New Hope Church is only the start of bloodier fighting to come. After the losses at New Hope, Sherman attempts to outflank Johnston's forces established at Picketts Mill at 5 p.m. on May 27th. The Union soldiers must traverse thick brush and undergrowth with the hope of reforming on the other side. Amongst those is journalist Ambrose Bierce, a first lieutenant and topographical officer.
The air was sibilant with streams and sheets of missiles in the steady, unvarying roar of small arms. The frequent shock of the cannon was rather felt than heard, but the gusts of grape which they blew into fat, populous wood were audible enough, screaming among the trees and cracking against their stems and branches.
General Claiborne's 10,000 troops are punished by the Confederate forces, who inflict losses of nearly 1,600 against the 500 rebel soldiers lost.
No command to fall back was given. None could have been heard. Man by man, the survivors withdrew at will, sifting through the trees into the cover of the ravines, among the wounded who could drag themselves back.
Determined to guard the railroad, Johnston plants his men along Brushy Mountain to Lost Mountain, roughly 8 miles west of Marietta, on June 4th. The line is built to defend Atlanta, but at 10 miles proves too long for Johnston's limited forces to defend. On the 18th, an advance by Sherman that captures Allatoona Pass forces Johnston to reform the line at Kennesaw Mountain. Known as the Gibraltar of Georgia, it is here the fighting will intensify. Back in Washington, D.C., new fissures and divisions open within the Union. The Democratic Party has split into two over peace and war. The Peace Democrats elect George B. McClellan for their anti-war platform, as on June 8th, President Abraham Lincoln is nominated for the Republican ticket. It will be a tight race, with Lincoln's victory or failure hinging on the success or failure of General Sherman, who has already faced 2 defeats within 3 days. The rain is unrelenting, falling in sheets on both armies, making an advance even more difficult for Sherman and his men. For 11 long days. General Sherman.
In action and on the march, rain is favorable. But in the woods, where all is blind and uncertain, it seems almost impossible for an army covering 10 miles of front to act in concert during wet and stormy weather.
Johnston and his men lay in wait along the long, defensible ridge of Kennesaw Mountain. The railroad also runs alongside the northernmost point of Kennesaw. Sherman must confront Johnston's forces there if he is to maintain any control of the vital supply line for his men. And so it is, with Sherman's men in a semicircle around the eastern side of the mountain, while Johnston and his men wait to face off on the western. They are roughly 15 miles from Atlanta.
The whole country is one vast fort, and Johnston must have at least 50 miles of connected trenches and finished batteries. We gain ground daily, fighting all the time. Our lines are now in close contact, and fighting incessant, with a good deal of artillery. As fast as we gain one position, the enemy has another already. Kennesaw is the key to the whole country.
Johnston's strategy has been to bring Sherman's army out and face off with the entrenched and fortified Confederate forces. It is the opposite of General John Bell Hood's philosophy, a proponent of aggressive attacks through attrition. Hood had been writing both Confederate President Davis and General Braxton Bragg to voice his displeasure towards Johnston's tactics, as Johnston would later learn. With the Union Army approaching Kennesaw Mountain, Johnston moves Hood's army to the left flank of the line from the extreme right to strengthen the line rather than lay in wait as an attack force. On June 20th, Hood is ordered to send Stevenson's division 3 miles from Marietta to be held in reserve. Hood also places the division of Hindman near Stevenson's. 2 days later, Hood receives word that Union forces are advancing. Eager for a fight, and with scant intelligence to back up his plans, Hood decides to attack and send Stevenson's troops towards Union forces. They stop around Mount Zion Church, and at about 2:30 encounter Union regiments who are pushed back by Confederate fire. Assuming they are merely a spearhead, Hood sends Stevenson and Hindman's forces after the Union soldiers. General Hood.
My impression is that there's a considerable force of infantry advancing in my front, but I have not yet felt them. And I have no means of judging except from the statements of the colonel commanded force from Hume's division, who was driven out from Cheney's before I came out. 2 regiments Federal cavalry have moved past my position on the road from Cheney's to Powder Springs. I gave notice of their move to General Armstrong and have just received a courier informing me that he is moving to meet them. If he attacks vigorously on that road, we shall compel the force at Cheney's to develop itself.
He sends them straight towards an entrenched Union line formed by Schofield's Army of the Ohio and Hooker's 20th Corps. Even as Confederate troops are initially driven back by the Union line, Hood sends them back in to attack. Darkness and Union reinforcements force Hood to retreat. He has lost around 1,000 men against Union losses of 350. Back at the Union camp, Sherman decides a full frontal assault is his only option, and on June 24th, makes plans for one 3 days later. The southernmost end of the Confederate lines are defended by Hood's regiment, with Hardee above him at the northernmost. Johnston is stationed further east in the town of Marietta. Schofield's Army of the Ohio will move slightly south. McPherson's Army of the Tennessee will feint towards the other end of the defenses and then attack further southwest of the target. It is Thomas's Army of the Cumberland that will push through with a major assault where Hood's army is the thinnest. He hopes to break the line and pour in. It is 8 a.m. on June 27th. Union cannons begin their bombardment of Kennesaw Mountain before moving in. The unforgiving terrain slows down Union soldiers trying to breach the thickets. The Confederates, meanwhile, await from their entrenchments, put on alert and made much more aware from the loud artillery. Thomas's army falls an hour behind schedule, yet still attempts to navigate the harsh vegetation to reach Hardee's corps. Two divisions, led by Brigadier Generals John Newton and Jefferson C. Davis, maintain a column rather than lines and face off against Major General Benjamin F. Cheatham and Patrick R. Cleburne's divisions. By advancing in column formation, they offer a singular target for the Confederate soldiers to fire upon, and they are quickly repulsed. Both Newton's brigades, under command of Brigadier Generals Wagner and Harker, failed to make it through. Davis's brigade, led by Colonel Daniel McCook, crosses over a creek to climb the hill and attack. Colonel Sam R. Watkins, Company H of the 1st Tennessee Regiment.
Talk about other battles, victories, shouts, cheers, and triumphs, but in comparison with this day's fight, all others dwarf into insignificance. The sun beaming down on our uncovered heads, the thermometer being 110 degrees in the shade, and a solid line of blazing fire right from the muzzles of the Yankee guns being poured right into our very faces, singeing our hair and clothes, the hot blood of our dead and wounded spurting on us, the blinding smoke and stifling atmosphere filling our eyes and mouths, and the awful concussion causing the blood to gush out of our noses and ears, and above all, the roar of battle made it a perfect pandemonium. Afterward, I heard a soldier express himself by saying that he thought hell had broke loose in Georgia. Sure enough.
Afterward, I heard a soldier express himself by saying that he thought hell had broke loose in Georgia. Sure enough. Lieutenant Colonel Allen L. Fonstock, 86th Illinois, Volunteer Infantry.
Near the top, we encountered the rebels in their strong works, in front of which were placed racks, stacked and wired together. Our men were compelled to break through these obstructions, but after running so far and receiving so galling a fire, in which Colonel McCook fell mortally wounded, many of them were spent. Captain Fellows rushed forward, calling to the men to follow, yelling, "Come on, boys, we will take," and fell dead a few feet from the ditch.
Both sides dubbed this part of Cheatham's Hill the Dead Angle. General Sherman.
By 11:30, the assault was in fact over and had failed. We had not broken the rebel line at either point, but our assaulting columns held their ground within a few yards of the rebel trenches, and there covered themselves with parapet. McPherson lost about 500 men and several valuable officers, and Thomas lost nearly 2,000 men. This was the hardest fight of the campaign up to that date.
At one point, a forest fire starts in the middle of the firefight, burning wounded Union soldiers to death. One nameless Arkansas colonel runs out with a white flag and calls out to the Union forces, "Come and get your men, for they are burning to death." Colonel Watkins.
At all times, every hour of day and night, you could hear the shrieks and screams of the poor fellows who were left on the field, and a stench so sickening as to nauseate the whole of both armies arose from the decaying bodies of the dead left lying on the field.
The two sides put their fighting aside and, unarmed, dive in to save the wounded and helpless men. The colonel allegedly receives 2 ivory-handled Colt 45s the next day from a grateful Union commander. At battle's end, the Union has lost about 3,000 men, while the Confederacy 1,000. The sounds of the firefight are heard in nearby Atlanta, and many citizens begin to leave their homes in anticipation of the violence to come. Sherman, reeling from Kennesaw Mountain, opts to reach past Johnston's line and cut him off further, and place his forces between Johnston's men and Atlanta. Johnston, shrewdly, under cover of night, slips away to the Chattahoochee River before the 4th of July. Johnston is only at the river for a week before being forced to move his army further back to Atlanta. His men systematically burn all bridges behind them in hopes of slowing down the approaching Federal soldiers. Meanwhile, in Virginia, Confederate General Lee has successfully held off the Union Army advancing towards Richmond. With the election so close, President Jefferson Davis knows the salvation of Atlanta is more than strategically important to the Confederacy, but is politically crucial as well. Were Lincoln to lose re-election to opposing candidate George B. McClellan, the new peace platform president will make moves to end the Civil War. Davis, displeased with the conflict in Georgia, makes the decision to oust General Johnston from his command.
As you have failed to arrest the advance of the enemy to the vicinity of Atlanta, far in the interior of Georgia, and express no confidence that you can defeat or repel him, you are hereby relieved from the command of the Army and Department of Tennessee, which you will immediately turn over to General Hood.
Hood, Stuart, and Hardee appeal to President Davis to let Johnston remain, but they are rebuffed. Around 10 o'clock that morning, Sherman learns of the change in ranks from an Atlanta newspaper and immediately inquires of his commanding officers about Hood.
I immediately inquired of General Schofield, who was his classmate at West Point, about Hood, as to his general character, etc., and learned that he was bold even to rashness, and courageous in the extreme.
With his newfound command, Hood wastes no time in planning an attack on Sherman's forces. Sherman has split his army to move into Atlanta, while the Army of the Cumberland is preparing to cross Peachtree Creek just north of Atlanta. With the creek behind them, Hood's Army of Tennessee plans to attack and pummel them on July 20th. A delay of 3 hours and an uncoordinated piecemeal assault fails to deter the Union forces. Each side starts with around 20,000 troops. Confederate losses are 2,500, while the Union are 1,900. West of Atlanta, General Sherman establishes his base in the Augustus Hurt House. It gives Sherman a high point from which he can observe the fighting, and a strategic point for an artillery battery. Sherman sends McPherson in a coordinated effort with the Army of the Tennessee to damage the Confederate rails and disrupt their supply line. Hood soon after sends Hardee and Wheeler to sneak up around the left of McPherson's troops and strike from behind. Superior Union artillery inflicts heavy losses on the Confederate forces, leaving 5,500 gone. The Union experiences its own loss in this, the Battle of Bald Hill. General McPherson finds himself surrounded by Confederate troops, and rather than surrender, begins a retreat on his horse. He is shot and killed. His horse returns, described in the words of Sherman as bleeding, wounded, and riderless. Also upset over McPherson's death is his old classmate, General Hood.
I will record the death of my classmate and boyhood friend, General James B. McPherson, the announcement of which caused me great sincere sorrow. Since we had graduated in 1853 and had each been ordered off on duty in different directions, it has not been our fortune to meet. Neither the years nor the difference of sentiment that had led us to range ourselves on opposite sides of the war had lessened my friendship. Indeed, the attachment formed in early youth was strengthened by my admiration and gratitude for his conduct towards people in the vicinity of Vicksburg. His considerate and kind treatment of them stood in bright contrast to the course pursued by many Federal officers.
As Confederate soldiers head towards the Troop Hurt House, the unfinished home built by the brother of Augustus Hurt, Union soldiers are placed on the second floor as sharpshooters. Confederate soldiers come in at the sides and sneak into the house, unknown to the men on the second floor. Private John Henry Puck, Company G of the 37th Ohio Veteran Volunteer Infantry, upon discovering rebel soldiers in the house.
If we were going to try to escape, we must act at once. So I, with perhaps a half dozen others, made a break from the window and jumped down.
Puck's fall is broken by a pile of knapsacks outside, and as he begins running away, he encounters Union Major General John Alexander Logan, known as Blackjack for his distinctive black mustache and swarthy complexion. He issues a battle cry that rallies the Union forces.
McPherson and revenge! Sing out if they come again! Put the bayonet to them!
Eventually, the new Confederate occupants will be attacked by artillery and forced out. General Howard inherits McPherson's command in time to move the Army of Tennessee around the Confederate left flank and around Atlanta to cut the city off from Hood's supply line coming out of Macon. Stoneman and McCook will move much further south past Atlanta and come together even further south at Lovejoy Station below Jonesboro, where they will completely eliminate Hood's railway supply at the source. Meanwhile, as Stoneman and his 6,500 soldiers are en route to Lovejoy Station, Stoneman receives permission from Sherman to free prisoners of war in Macon and in Andersonville afterwards. Bringing 2,500 men with him, Stoneman deviates and heads to liberate the prisoners anyway, but is stopped on July 31st by Georgia militia. He and his men are pursued and captured by General Wheeler and are themselves locked in the Macon prison. McCook, leading a smaller army by himself, successfully destroys the railway at Lovejoy Station and barely escapes capture. At the same time, General Schofield is sent to the north bank of the Utoy Creek on August 2nd. If they gain possession of the Macon Road, they gain an entryway into Atlanta. Schofield is joined by some of Major John M. Palmer's 14 Corps on August 4th. Combined, they will launch an offensive at the Confederate line and hopefully break it. Palmer refuses to let Schofield command him and argues himself the superior rank, despite Sherman's orders for him to fall into line under Schofield. But Palmer is insistent and is forced to resign his commission the next day. Brigadier General Jefferson C. Davis takes over command, and the morning of August 5th, they attempt to cross the creek in force. The Union troops successfully surge forward, but stop to regroup. By the time they are ready to push forward once more, they encounter a more fortified Confederate line led by William B. Bate, and they are forced back. Unable to take the railroad, the Union troops entrenched themselves near the Confederate line. It is a major loss for Schofield's men, 850, while the Confederacy only loses 35. General Lee congratulates Bate and his men.
Soldiers who fight with the coolness and determination that these men did will always be victorious over any reasonable number.
Skirmishing maintains along the creek and around Atlanta. Confederate Major General Joe Wheeler moves north to turn the tables on Sherman's forces and destroy part of the railroad to sever the Union supply line. It is August 10th. According to Wheeler, he destroys a mile of track and captures over 1,000 beef cattle intended for the Federal troops. His mission leaves an opening for Brigadier General H. Judson Kilpatrick to attack the Atlanta and West Point Railroad on his way to Lovejoy Station. Kilpatrick and his men arrive at Lovejoy Station just as a train arrives. Kilpatrick is a firebrand. Having been injured during the Battle of Resaca, he defied doctors' orders against returning to the theater upon hearing of Sherman's progress. He first had to start his return to war from a carriage, but he is now once more able to ride horseback. They wait, perhaps unaware of the Confederate cavalry led by Brigadier General Daniel Ross chasing after them. As the Union soldiers move in to take the supply train, they are shocked at the sudden appearance of Confederate soldiers, 300 of them, under the command of Brigadier General Reynolds, who have been transported by rail to reinforce Hood's forces. It is chaos. 4 artillery batteries aid the Union soldiers and force the Confederate advance back against the railroad as a barricade is hastily built. A total of 70 shells are fired in 15 minutes. Gunfire emanates from the rear, and Kilpatrick's men are stunned to see Ross and his cavalry setting up a barricade behind them, with a single howitzer stationed on a nearby hill. Kilpatrick and his men are sandwiched between enemy forces. He realizes there is one way out. His men will have to charge and break through one of the Confederate lines, most realistically, Ross's cavalry. Arranging his men in columns of 4, Kilpatrick gives the rallying call. And they charge into one spot of Ross's thin defensive line, shattering it and blowing past Ross and his bewildered men, 30 of whom rush to protect their one cannon. Union troops, however, capture the howitzer and take it with them. They have escaped certain death this time, but what dangers await them in the rest of the war zone? Bombarding Atlanta was not enough for Sherman to lure the Confederate forces out of the city, and they keep him from going in and overtaking it. The citizens of Atlanta are just as much under attack as their military. General Hood.
It was painful yet strange to mark how expert grew the old men, women, and children in building their little underground forts in which to fly for safety during the storm of shell and shot.
Sherman, facing political pressure, increased by Grant's costly failure to take Richmond, makes a desperate move to take the city. With his men nearing the end of their own supplies and enlistments running low, Sherman must cut Hood off and starve his men out of Atlanta. On August 25th, Sherman moved 6 of his 7 infantry corps from their position to move south and destroy Hood's supply line once and for all. General Hood does not realize that Sherman is sending most of his army and sends Lieutenant General William J. Hardee and S.D. Lee with only 2 corps to stop the Union troops. They are vastly outnumbered. 2,200 Confederates are lost, compared to only 172 Union soldiers. The next day, Sherman sends the Army of the Tennessee forward to crush the Confederate forces making a stand in Jonesboro. Combined with a frontal assault by General Jefferson C. Davis, the Confederate forces are pushed back. Despite all of this, Sherman is still unable to defeat Hardee's steadfast forces. Amongst those looking at the ruins of war, as displayed on the blood-soaked battlefield, is the 101st Indiana. Organized in Wabash and mustered on September 7th, 1862, this infantry has already seen battles such as Chickamauga, Resaca, New Hope Church, and now Jonesboro. They have witnessed more than their fair share of bloodshed. Private Levi P. Fodrea of the 101st.
The vision that was so deeply impressed upon our minds as we gazed upon the fallen will never be erased as long as we have our reason.
On the Confederate side, Watkins witnesses a death during breakfast.
We were sopping gravy out with some cold cornbread when Captain W.C. Flournoy of the Martin Guards hallooed out, "Look out, Sam! Look, look!" I just turned my head, and in turning, the cannonball knocked my hat off, and striking Lieutenant Whitaker full in the side of the head, carried away the whole of the skull part, leaving only the face. His brains fell in the plate from which we were sopping, and his head fell into my lap, deluging my face and clothes with his blood.
Even though escape seems impossible for the Confederates, they slip away at night. General Hood must admit defeat. With their supply line cut and their army dwindling, the Confederates evacuate Atlanta and destroy the Atlanta munitions depot, as well as an 80-car munitions train, to keep them from Union hands. Sherman and his men can hear the explosions as far down as the depot of Rough and Ready. On September 2nd, General Slocum's 20th Corps rides into Atlanta and accepts the city's surrender to Union forces. General Sherman receives the news via a note by Slocum, who rode into Atlanta unopposed.
As the news spread to the army, the shouts that arose from our men, the wild hallooing and glorious laughter, were to us a full recompense for the labor and toils and hardships through which we had passed in the previous 3 months.
Sherman and his men arrive on September 7th to occupy Atlanta. He orders an evacuation of all families and civilians.
The use of Atlanta for warlike purposes is inconsistent with its character as a home for families.
With Atlanta captured and the Confederacy's valuable supply line cut, re-election is almost certain for President Lincoln. On November 8th, President Lincoln wins re-election with 55% of the total votes. The Union's defeat of the Confederacy in Atlanta deals a blow to Southern morale and restores confidence in a Union victory in the Civil War. But the war still rages on. After dealing with further entanglements with Hood's armies, Sherman begins a psychological attack. First, 30% of Atlanta is set afire by Sherman's men on November 15th, and they pillage everything in sight. Then, with 60,000 soldiers, Sherman begins a 285-mile march to Savannah, Georgia. Living off the land of the Confederacy and burning houses and barns of those staunch Confederates who stood up to them, they arrive at Savannah on December 21st and overtake the undefended city. Sherman's reign of terror then moves through to Charleston, South Carolina. He calls it his March to the Sea. General Johnston, trying to retire to Columbia, South Carolina, is called back into service with hesitation by President Davis, who was under public and political pressure on February 25, 1865. Johnston is reinstated, now in command of the Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and the Department of North Carolina and Southern Virginia. Meanwhile, with Sherman's march to the sea accomplished, he moves his men northward through the Carolinas. His goal is to head to Petersburg, Virginia, to join up with Grant and destroy the heart of the Confederacy. Sherman's forces are divided into a left wing, commanded by Major General Henry W. Slocum, and a right wing, under Major General Oliver O. Howard. They push towards Goldsboro, North Carolina. As Slocum's left wing heads towards Goldsboro on March 19th, they face Johnston's entrenched forces placed to stop the advance 1 mile south of Bentonville. Slocum assumes his forces are facing disparate Confederate cavalry, not a force of 17,000 soldiers. Despite the shock of the attack, Slocum's forces hold on, but their left flank is driven back by the Confederate Army of Tennessee, allowing rebel forces to take over that position and begin an artillery attack on the Union line. By midnight, Union reinforcements arrive, and the Confederate forces are pushed back, entrenching in their original positions. The second day brings light skirmishing as Johnston removes his wounded, and both forces prepare for the inevitable eruption of violence. Union forces are now swelled to nearly 60,000, while the Confederates are only 21,900 strong. During the fight on March 21st, Union Major General Joseph A. Mower requests a reconnaissance mission with 2 brigades, but instead strikes on the Confederate left flank. Aiming for the guarded Mill Creek Bridge, Mower hopes to eliminate the Confederates' only avenue of retreat. General Sherman.
General Mower, ever rash, broke through the rebel lines on his extreme left flank and was pushing straight for Bentonville and the bridge across Mill Creek. I ordered him back to connect with his own corps, and, lest the enemy should concentrate on him, ordered the whole rebel line to be engaged with a strong skirmish fire. I think I made a mistake there, and should rapidly have followed Mower's lead with the whole of the right wing, which would have brought on a general battle, and it could not have resulted otherwise than successfully to us by reason of our vastly superior numbers.
Pulled back a mere mile from the bridge by Sherman, Johnston and his staff are allowed to retreat on foot that night. Burning the Mill Creek Bridge behind them, Johnston is outmatched and well aware that he can do no more than just annoy Sherman.
At night, all the wounded that could bear transportation had been removed, so that we had no object for remaining in a position made very hazardous by the stream behind us, rendered unfordable by recent rain.
But the fighting is slated to end. On April 9th, 1865, after Virginia falls to Union forces, General Lee surrenders the Confederacy at the courthouse in Appomattox, Virginia. 2 days later, news reaches Sherman, and on April 14th, he receives a letter under the flag of truce by General Johnston.
The results of the recent campaign in Virginia have changed the relative military condition of the belligerents. I am therefore induced to address you, in this form, the inquiry whether, in order to stop the further effusion of blood and devastation of property, you are willing to make a temporary suspension of active operations and to communicate to Lieutenant General Grant, commanding the armies of the United States, the request that he will take like action in regard to other armies, the object being to permit the civil authorities to enter into the needful arrangements to terminate the existing war.
A delay by federal officers keeps Sherman's reply from reaching Johnston until the 16th. The 2 generals are to meet halfway to negotiate a peace between their forces at the home on the Bennett farm. When alone, behind closed doors, and without other witnesses, Sherman reveals a telegram to his long-running adversary. President Abraham Lincoln, on April 14th, was assassinated by the bullet of deranged actor John Wilkes Booth. The president, having successfully been re-elected to office, died the next day. He will never see the peace and reunification he had so long strived for. On April 18th, Sherman drafts their agreement, which covers the surrender and amnesty of Confederate soldiers in the South. The terms are rejected by the federal government for recognizing the Confederacy as a governing body, and General Grant is sent to Raleigh to relieve Sherman of command and enforce a treaty more in line with Lee's earlier surrender that only recognizes the Army itself. They meet again on April 26th, with Johnston directly disobeying Jefferson Davis's orders to join up with him, and the peace is signed by Johnston and General Schofield, whose taking over departmental command relieves Sherman of the political burden, and approval by Grant allows the peace to officially begin.
I made this convention to spare the blood of this gallant little army, to prevent further sufferings of our people by the devastation and ruin inevitable from the marches of invading armies, and to avoid the crime of waging a hopeless war.
The terms allow for Confederate troops to receive transportation home, a chance to keep 1/7 of their arms, and amnesty for their role in the war. In all, 89,270 Confederate soldiers in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida laid down their arms. It is the largest surrender of the Civil War. The Civil War is officially over. Perhaps it is best put by Sherman himself.
Young men think war is all glory. It is all hell.
The United States will struggle to reunite itself from the bloodiest battle in its short history. This new beginning could not have happened this way if not for the Union victory in the battle for Atlanta.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.